We are anonymous.
Welcome world, we are anonymous. On this occasion, we are going to show you the great business of specialists in mental illnesses, such as psychiatrists, psychologists, as well as we will expose the charismatic psychiatric hospitals of the government, as well as the expensive private hospitals, as well as relatives of these humans who by birth, or by drugs, or by some post-traumatic events are presented with a temporary or permanent mental problem, and the most sad and incomprehensible that the same family mistreat and leave to suffer alone the disease. And in some cases they are a high index of cases where the family members are the ones who violate them, mistreat them, beat them for not understanding them, lock them up, or in many cases abandon them to their fate. For these relatives without conscience or compassion for their relatives with illness is mental, and that they do nothing to help them and safeguard the integrity of a patient with a mental illness, we call them the collective anonymous, to humanize and raise awareness and care for their patients. Because family members who have never had a mental illness do not understand their family members with mental illness and mistreat them, and who mistakenly believe that they alone will be able to come out of your illness and mistreat, beat, and leave you alone in these terrible and devastating mental illnesses, which are often triggered by emotional problems, and which, due to this apathy, do not progress the relatives, and also the abandonment in which they have them, to their relatives with some mental illness alone in the world of controlled medicines. And the most serious thing is that the unconscious relatives think that they are taken, that they sleep, and since he is a vegetable, drugged by his relative who takes these controlled medicines, family members always think that their lives will not be affected by the families of these patients' mental illness, and is crazy, as well as their time, their activities, or their travels, or their parties. They do not forget to talk about the mentally ill with their friends, these unscrupulous family discs, because without no ethics expose their patients with any mental illness. It will be that way. They believe that they will never get sick of something like that. Hopefully never get sick, these inhumane relatives, but the collective anonymous, we say that nobody is exempt from having a mental illness at some point in life, because for your information of these inhumane relatives, we inform you that even a bad diet and assault can trigger a mental illness. So to those inhumane relatives who mistreat mentally ill patients, please awaken from your selfishness, and we call you the collective anonymous, that please take care of them. Besides that, many people do not have the conscience that in their crisis of the patients with some mental illness, which often cause the same relatives and the controlled medicines, they do not understand them, and they want that the conscious are the patients themselves, being that those who should worry and take care of the sick are the relatives, not the other way around, the sick person of the relatives. It is unheard of that these relatives are, and they are reflected with the friends, as they are the ones who suffer of pain for taking care of them. Besides that, they treat them as crazy, and that does not help at all. Sick of some mental illness, as it could be something minimum, like anxiety, depression, because the relatives, besides not understanding them and taking care of them, disrespect them, treating them like crazy, and that they have to follow the medication to compose that they say or demand. The relatives, the sick, even the relatives themselves, see that their family member already did dependence on medications, as the psychiatrists elegantly call them, and in real words, and are addicted to controlled drugs and live a literal hell. The patient of a mental illness, and that is not even seen by family members. It is very sad. Relatives of patients with mental illness help them and take care of them. We call the collective anonymous, and do not put them in psychiatric clinics, and much less let them be medicated for something minimal. Please, that is our request to the relatives of someone with mental illness, and not leave them alone, because there are many mental illness patients who are also forced to be destitute. This is outrageous, citizens of the world. Another problem with psychiatrists or psychologists is that in almost all cases they are wrong in diagnoses and misinformed family members, putting more against family members with regard to the patient with a mental illness. And another outrageous problem is that if someone enters by some minimal mental illness such as depression or anxiety to a psychiatric hospital, and at the moment it enters and leaves a relative as responsible there, and the patient lost because already admitted to the hospital, loses his will, we mean the collective anonymous will leave is the best medical care, if only if it will leave if the patient designated as responsible, requested, if not requested by that family member, the patient with a mental illness will never leave. That is something totally absurd. If the patient enters by their own will, and they ask you to leave a responsible relative you believe as in all other diseases just to inform you of your recovery, the mentally ill are relatives. And also that does not tell the patient that psychiatric hospital admission for a mental illness, and that is another lack of professional ethics. To give you an example, the patient gave him only a depression. He is not mentally incapacitated, as his will is not valid within the psychiatric hospital. And also not believe anything that manifests the mental patient, or based on what they ask the family member to accompany him, being that maybe that family member does not know anything about the life of the patient, but the psychiatric hospital believes more familiar than the mentally ill. From there, that lack of professional ethics. This is the most unheard of, and we continue to expose the atrocities and bad practices of these psychiatric hospitals of the absurd, then part of not believing what he tells the psychiatrists. They believe the family members who accompany him, not the patient, and also that the patient, because he has just one depression, loses his rights to choose not to continue in that or another psychiatric hospital. Simple fact of appointing a responsible relative no longer be taken into account their wishes as a patient who entered by their own will, and also the patient with mental illness paid the psychiatric hospital bill. Then ask them, we took the anonymous collective to these absurd psychiatric hospitals because by placing a family member as responsible, that is the one who decides for the depression patient. The anonymous collective we tell those death hospitals called psychiatric hospitals because when they put a certain family who is responsible, who will decide the fate of the patient in the psychiatric hospital, that's the other question for those in charge of the health sector. That correct that and that these psychiatric hospitals conduct themselves in the most ethical way with both patients, like not to do this rogue with patients with mental illnesses, and conduct themselves as they should do to these psychiatric hospitals of death. And another problem of the health sector very serious in these so-called psychiatrists or doctors who prescribe these controlled drugs is that, as they do not know the real reach that these controlled drugs produce because they prescribe having the patient fall. This is unprecedented and very serious, and the most serious thing prescribed by these controlled medicines is prescribed by any specialty, as in some cases even dermatologists prescribe these controlled drugs to patients with atopic dermatitis without any ethical responsibility for the damage that controlled medication will do to the patient with atopic dermatitis. Nor will they be informed that they are prescribing drugs that will affect their behavior and affect their health, and what they are doing with that drug, literally drug addict to the patient. If he had pimples, now he will also have anxiety because of that medicine that the dermatologist or dermatologist gave him. This is a health situation that nobody talks about. But the collective anonymous we are exposing, because it is enough to be killing human beings by means of controlled medicines. This is very outrageous and very serious that you are doing bad medical practices and without any professional ethics, and this happens all over the world. And besides that, we are going to investigate if you are paid by pharmaceutical companies because their patients buy more and more controlled medicines. That is why doctors and psychiatrists prescribe them without any ethics or clemency to respect the life and health of the human beings of the world. And all the exposed and based psychiatrists, psychiatric hospitals, and the relatives of somebody with some mental illness. Not only it is seen in the ordinary citizens, which sits of them nobody finds out. That is why the collective anonymous. We will put them the case of human beings who have suffered and continue to suffer what we have exposed in this video, and not because of yellowness or to harm them, but for their families to wake up and help them, and society in general respect and help them. Then we will name beings known humans as world examples that have gone through and endured what has been exposed in this video. And we will mention them as an example that happened in something that is exposed in this video of the collective anonymous is the case of singer Sinead O'Connor, Eminem, who are still alive. Thank God, because others we will mention are already killed by overdoses of controlled drugs like Michael Jackson, Patch Adams, Kurt Cobain, Robin Williams, Chris Cornell, Chester Bennington, Lil Peep, Whitney Houston, Amy Winehouse, Elvis Presley, to name a few well-known people, and many more who are still imprisoned in that hell that creates controlled drugs, and the most unheard of psychiatrists. They sleep without any remorse nor any problem of the damage they are causing with their bad medical practices and lack of ethics and compassion for the human being, because they do not feel any remorse to bring death to their patients with their devastating controlled medications. And these unprotected human beings in all cases end up committing suicide because of the desperation they feel for this addiction to these so-called controlled drugs, and literally take them to mental hell without ever having peace. These patients of these, according to them, psychiatrists, saints, or make a zombie junkie to those who unfortunately have a mental illness, either temporary or congenital. This is terrible. Listen, brothers and sisters, the testimony of this singer in total helplessness and also alone living her illness, which is living alone in a hotel, singer Sinead O'Connor. This is very painful and sad that human beings discriminate against the sick with some mental illness. And the most outrageous that the family members of the sick person with a mental illness discriminate against them and do not support them with this type of mental illness. Please, citizens of the world, hear it please, and do something, citizens of the world, for it, and for all those who suffer from mental illness. Please, we call them the collective anonymous. Not to discriminate the sick with any mental illness, and the most unprecedented thing that the relatives leave them for God. Citizens of the world, awaken is urgent, because they are unprotected human beings suffering alone in a hell of drugs, which were prescribed by doctors called by capitalism psychiatrists without ethics or principles or love for the human being.
I'm not staying alive for me. For me, if it was me, I'd be gone straight away back to my mom. Because I've walked this earth alone for 2 years now, as punishment for being mentally fucking ill and being angry that nobody would fucking take care of me. Specifically for being suicidal, actually, and for being angry. Everybody's so afraid of an angry woman, and what do I do when I'm angry? I write angry emails. I don't stand.
'Cause nothing compares to you.
I'm now living in a Travelodge motel in the arse end of New Jersey. I'm all by myself, and there's absolutely nobody in my life except my doctor, my psychiatrist, the sweetest man on earth, who says I'm his hero. And that's about the only fucking thing keeping me alive at the moment. The fact that I'm his bloody hero. And that's kind of pathetic. And I gave so much love in my life. Mental illness, you know, it's a bit like drugs. It doesn't give a shit who you are. And equally, you know what's worse? It's the stigma. It doesn't give a shit who you are. And suddenly, all the people who are supposed to be loving you, taking care of you, are treating you like shit. And then when you're angry or you're hurt because they're doing it, it's like a witch hunt. They're pointing at you, going to see, this is why we don't want to know. And it's like, oh. But I'm still sitting here after 2 years, and I'm begging to be brought home. Somebody who loves me to come and get me. That's what I keep saying. No answer, never, from nobody. Nobody wants me. Why? Because I was angry that they all fucked off. Then they say they didn't fuck off while they're fucking off. That's what happens when people think, mistakenly or otherwise, that you have a mental illness. They use it as something to invalidate every fucking thing you think, do, say, and feel. Everything you think, do, say, and feel is suddenly completely fucking invalid. I've been wandering the globe for 2 fucking years. I'm a 5'4" little fucking woman, wandering the world for 2 years by myself. Nobody in my fucking life. Nobody. You know what I mean? And I'm all by my fucking self, and it's a crime, and it should not be acceptable to any man that knows me and claims to love and care about me. I am making this video because I am one of millions, and that should be our fucking catchphrase from now on. One of millions, one of fucking millions. Why are we alone? What the fuck did we do? The people who suffer from mental illness are the most vulnerable people on earth. We can't take care of our fucking selves, you idiots.
Then, sisters and brothers of the world, the collective anonymous, we expose everything that a mentally ill person suffers in the hands of these inhuman psychiatrists of hell, which make bad practices, making all patients vile and without any scruples, exclusively drug addicts, the poor individuals who for some bad circumstance have some adversity, either to give them an example, brothers and sisters, as an assault, a loss of a loved one, a rape, abuse, or violence, a kidnapping, tried a person, etc. Because for these pitiful events that the individual suffers do suffer a post-traumatic stress, and these corrupt and inhumane specialists of mental diseases, called psychiatrists, the only thing they know how to do and very well, literally, are pure drug addicts based on controlled drugs, is why they charge those so exorbitant sums of money of thousands to hear to patients for 4-5 minutes, every 2 times a week, and at the end, give your controlled medications, and even your medication, so that you do not tremble of so much drug that they are prescribed without measuring if they were killed by your medications and doses. Then the collective anonymous psychiatrists, we say, directly, that you, without any ethics, only are dedicated to enrich themselves by hearing people who drug and who studied exclusively to make the patient a drug addict, without any clemency some, and send the patient or the human being to the darkness of his mind. We call it the collective anonymous, where the body asks for and orders controlled medications, doing it, sadly and desperately for the patient, a desperate zombie, asking more and more drugs, so until this desperation lead to an overdose, ending the patient's own life, and it is there, where nobody does anything, from the beginning to the end. Take patients to an abyss without end, because they are drugged with the lowest ethics and indifference on the part of the psychiatrist for a human being. But, yes, they do not forget to charge their fees in the order of between at least $75 for 45 minutes per day up to $175 45 minutes. Others who specialize in drugs, as they say, only prescribe drugs that kill. So the question that we ask the collective anonymous to those so-called mental health specialists, called psychiatrists, you studied only to make pure drug addicts and killed them based on controlled medicines, as well as to only be enriched by so expensive that they charge, but so expensive that they are these drugs that they prescribe to their patients. Also to make millionaires to the pharmaceutical companies that produce these drugs that you prescribe as if they were only sweets, that we want to say the collective anonymous, in quantities and varieties to kill the individual in one shot. But thank God, the human being resists, until the body collapses with so much drug. The other point to expose is how these psychiatric hospitals are enriched and how are inhuman, and show them brothers and sisters who proceed and behave without any compassion for the suffering of the patient with a mental illness, but you even inhuman psychiatrists put them more into an endless maze of frightening and cruel suffering for their outrageous practices. That is why the collective anonymous ask them, gentlemen psychiatrists, because your low practices on your part so without ethics, nor any no human compassion for your patients with mental illnesses that fall into their hands, could you please answer us? And there we leave the collective anonymous, the exposed, to the corresponding authorities so that they do something of justice for the patients with mental illnesses for lack of nutrients, as well as for the patients with congenital mental diseases, such as bipolarity, pride, limiting personality, schizophrenia, mystic schizophrenia, etc. Do something about this atrocity. For this suffering for these human beings, hospitals, and pharmaceutical industries that create these drugs, which are only moved by power and greed alone. We are the change. Knowledge is free, we're legion. We do not forget, and do not wait for us, because we are already here, we are all one. Namaste Mundo. Wake up the family and the sick with some mental illness of these vexations that these psychiatric hospitals do, as well as the psychiatrists. And the relatives who take literally what the psychiatrist tells them, they also become accomplices at the moment the patient dies of an overdose. And there, the psychiatrist and the hospital are separated, because they say it gave him a psychotic crisis, and an overdose was provoked, and they are separated with no ethics or responsibility. This is not possible, that happens even in the 21st century. Wake up world.